Picturing Sustainability and Resilience. Hello, my name's David Cross and I'm a reader in art and design at University of the Arts, London. I studied graphic design at St Martin's School of Art from 1986 to 89, and I went on to study visual communication at the Royal College of Art, graduating in 1991. After graduating, I practiced for many years as a fine artist, whilst also working as an academic. As an artist and academic, I'm interested in the outcomes of visual culture, which range from Netflix dramas to data visualization, from satellite imaging to sculptural installation. But I'm also concerned with the processes of visual culture, which encompass the reflective and questioning potential of art, and the problem-solving and communicating potential of design. Art practice can do more than produce aesthetic experiences. It allows for ambiguity and paradox, and can generate productive forms of doubt. In situations of complexity and uncertainty, art can offer a safe space in which people can test their assumptions and compare different perspectives. Similarly, design can do more than create the look and feel of a message or product. Design can be a way of thinking that engages strategically with whole systems and creates new approaches to collaboration for social, economic and environmental benefit. The practices of picturing are common to art and design. Picturing includes framing, representing, and envisioning. Framing refers to how issues are defined and categorized. Representing refers to how visual signs operate within codes. And envisioning refers to how new ideas are proposed through visual forms. Today, I'd like to engage with the problematics of those practices of picturing and to apply them to sustainability and resilience. To do that, I'll need to first briefly describe and relate these two key terms, sustainability and resilience. I was a BA graphic design student in 1987 when the World Commission on Environment and Development published the report Our Common Future. In it, the authors defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is still the most widely used definition of sustainability, and it positions sustainability in an ethical framework of obligation to others, in a way that requires ecological, economic, and social issues to be balanced or reconciled. To strengthen the association between visual culture and sustainability, I made this version of the conventional Venn diagram, but softened the hard boundaries of categories by showing them as a layering of additive colour. The red, green and blue light of video, cinema and computer screen displays, which carry so many of our visual ideas. Since the definition of sustainability was published in 1987, the term sustainability has been so widely used, and I would say misused, that its meaning has become deeply ambiguous and contested, and the term may have become completely depleted and might even fall out of use. This image is from the website of Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is a global aerospace and weapons corporation based in the USA, so you might imagine that my definition or understanding of sustainability is quite different from theirs. If sustainability is a complex and contested term, then so is resilience. There are various definitions of the concept of resilience, but the dominant ones today are mostly based on a set of practical, material, or technical capacities. For example, the 100 Resilient Cities programme, developed by Arup and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, defines city resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses and systems within a city to survive, adapt and grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. To consider how this definition frames the issue of resilience, we might start with the key terms survive, adapt and grow. Most of us would want to survive, but invoking the concept of survival in this situation frames resilience not merely in relation to problems, but to existential threats. I think it calls to mind the maxim survival of the fittest of social Darwinism, which justifies competition as natural. Some stresses and shocks are inevitable, and so we must adapt to them. But if those stresses and shocks were negligently caused by others, should we only adapt, or shouldn't we also resist? Similarly, are we not subject to an ethical obligation to reduce, to mitigate the damage we inflict on others through our industrial consumer way of life? Finally, the assumption that cities must grow elides the difference between equitably accommodating growing populations and pursuing economic growth, which under capitalism is based on social inequality and ecological debt. This photograph puts the viewer in between two conflicting parties, framing the opposing positions of the protagonists as though they're balanced. The fact that both sides are wearing uniform, gloves and helmets reinforces the idea of formal equivalence between police and firefighters. But the truncheon is a symbol of coercive physical force, and using it to suppress calls for social justice by the firefighters, I think, signals a potential crisis of legitimacy for the neoliberal state. So, having outlined the contested nature of our key terms, sustainability and resilience, we can explore them in relation to the methods of picturing. The first of these is framing, which refers to how issues are defined and categorized. The image of the Earth from space is a prime example of the contested relationship between visual culture and environmental issues. As part of the space race, a symbolic rivalry between the competing ideologies of communism and capitalism, NASA's Apollo 8 mission was driven by a gaze that looked outward to the moon. But one of its most lasting achievements was this historic image which turned and looked back at the Earth. For a time, this image seemed to crystallize the hopes of a generation. Perhaps humanity could redefine itself by a universal awareness in which the Earth and the world are not split from each other but joined as a living, connected system. Yet Wolfgang Sachs has argued that, in this unifying image, all traces of human reality disappear, and only the permutations of the biosphere are to be seen. No traditions, no institutions, no history. The world has vanished into the Earth. It's a compelling statement, but I'm not sure I entirely agree with it. When we look at an image, we interpret its meaning in relation to our own previous knowledge and our way of understanding, as well as the other signifying elements in the communicating situation. For me, the Earthrise photograph is not a moment of closure, much less erasure. It does offer an ambiguous vision of both technological power and ecological fragility, though. Also in 1968, this groundbreaking book by Buckminster Fuller reframed one of our basic assumptions by proposing that we should see planet Earth as a spaceship, and that as its crew, humanity needs to learn how to maintain its life support system, especially the atmosphere. The philosopher Peter Sloterdijk wrote, "From that critical moment onwards, the good old Earth could no longer be considered some natural variable, but as a huge artificial construct. It was no longer the foundation of things, and instead a vehicle." In the Netflix drama Breaking Bad, Walter White, a chemistry lecturer in the USA, is diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. Without healthcare insurance or support from the state, Walter's diagnosis precipitates a life crisis. To pay his hospital bills and to provide for his family after his death, Walter sets up a chemistry lab in this giant Winnebago motorhome, making top-quality methamphetamine. Gradually, his behaviour transforms from stability and coherence into a double life of contradictory values. He's split between absolute care for his home and family and complete disregard for the damage he's inflicting on his community and society. The narrative is rich with contradictions, ambiguities and double codings. When police try to seize his drug-making laboratory, they're refused entry on the legal grounds that the Winnebago is not a vehicle, it's a home with wheels on. So framing can be a decisive act of categorization. In this self-portrait by Giuseppe Pannoni, titled Reverse Your Eyes from 1970, the artist wore mirrored contact lenses. This simple act challenges the viewer to imagine a social encounter in which both artist and viewer are transfixed by the image of themselves as isolated from each other. In his 1970 book, La Révolution urbaine, The Urban Revolution, Henri Lefebvre charts the transformation from the town to the urban society, which he shows to be the ultimate product of industrialization. Lefebvre chillingly observes the link between the rise of the consumer society and the emergence of an individualized subjectivity. In our affluent consumer society, we've been encouraged to think as private individuals, to approach problems in isolation from each other, and to focus on symptoms rather than causes. As a physical manifestation of a problem boundary, flood defences can be vital forms of resilience to extreme weather events. But a more sustainable strategy would be to expand the problem boundary to engage with the whole river valley as an ecosystem. Even then, the problem of flooding spills over from land management to connect with climate breakdown. And to solve that problem, we must leave fossil fuels in the ground and decarbonise our whole society. This really cannot be addressed by private individuals acting independently from each other. What's needed is collective action. Logorama, directed by François Allot, Hervé de Cresty and Ludovic Huplin, is an animated film set in an artificial landscape composed entirely of corporate brands and populated by commercial mascot characters. Centering on a robbery that becomes engulfed by a cataclysm, the narrative offers a brilliantly morbid satire on the destructive trajectory of consumerism. Framing can direct our understanding to a certain scale, or it can constrain it to a certain domain. For example, the idea of a carbon footprint implies that we should focus on our personal lifestyle choices as consumers. Carbon literacy training often does this, so we need to be on our guard. But in a big step away from the personal responsibility of carbon footprinting, the emerging discourse of climate attribution is tracing carbon emissions to carbon producers, and is using the term carbon fingerprinting for the practice of identifying corporate liability. Carbon fingerprinting reframes climate change and ecological collapse from the realm of tragedy to that of crime. The emerging field of climate litigation connects to work led by international lawyer Polly Higgins for ecocide to be recognised as the 5th international crime against peace. A law against ecocide would hold persons in a position of superior responsibility, such as heads of fossil fuel corporations, accountable for their actions. And rather than just pay a fine from their vast undertaxed profits, corporate chiefs would get a taste of prison food. Okay, looking at picturing, we've touched on framing, how issues are defined and categorised, and now we're going to go over representing, how visual signs operate within codes. Back in 1978, Judith Williamson's book Decoding Advertisements showed how advertisements address us as consumers rather than as citizens. Robert Goldman developed this argument, showing how viewers supply the interpretive labour necessary to assembling sign values, and hence the possibility of surplus values. He shows that advertisers no longer address us as passive consumers of meaning. They invite us to decode advertisements and to combine interpretation with authorship. In this example, fashion brand Diesel addresses us as viewers who know very well that consumerism is contributing to climate change and who feel that conflict between our ethical obligations and our hedonistic choices. This image shows the British petroleum oil rig Deepwater Horizon as it exploded and sank in April 2010, killing 11 crew and devastating the environment. The photo was taken not by a professional photographer or journalist, but by an oil rig worker escaping in a boat, a survivor of the blast who gave the photo away. Back in 1972, the authors of The Limits to Growth used the term business as usual to label a problem at the heart of industrialism. And this is that as more easily accessible and higher quality resources are used up, the amount of capital machinery needed to extract what is left increases. As expenses rise and revenues fall, corporations sustain their profits by cutting costs, such as on safety. I think there's a powerful relationship between this disaster, which resulted from greed, and the image of it, which was an expression of generosity at a moment of great loss. But following the disaster, the branding agency Landor aimed to rebuild trust in BP, positioning the brand as a key corporate sponsor of the London 2012 Olympics. Here, the image of a Paralympic athlete invokes the human body as a symbol combining imperfection or damage with beauty, power, and the determination to succeed. In February 2020, climate activists sneaked a Trojan horse into the grounds of the British Museum, hijacking the meaning of their new exhibition, Troy, Myth and Reality, in order to protest against the museum's relationship with BP. The activists said, "We peacefully occupied the building and grounds for 3 days to shine a spotlight on the oil company's impacts around the world and the ways in which the museum's own history and that of its sponsor were born out of colonialism and empire." Launched in October 2018, the Extinction Rebellion has issued 3 core demands to the British government. 1. Tell the truth about the scale of the ecological crisis by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. 2. Act now to reach zero emissions by 2025. 3. Create and be led by a citizens' assembly on the climate and ecological crisis. Extinction Rebellion is not offering its members hope of success. Instead, they're demanding action as a moral imperative. They're not asking for a small contribution to a realistic goal. Instead, they're demanding a major sacrifice for a greater ideal. By demanding rather than asking politely for action from government and citizens, Extinction Rebellion have challenged assumptions about political representation, while capturing media attention with carefully staged public spectacles. But after an Extinction Rebellion event in London in April last year, these women were interviewed by The Guardian, and I was struck by what they said. If this had been anything but Caucasian people, there would have been armed police officers and a big problem. The question of whose point of view, whose interest is represented by a visual image or artifact often goes unasked. And when it goes unasked, that may be when the image has its greatest ideological effect. But at certain moments, representation itself comes into focus as both a political and cultural practice, such as when the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was torn down from its plinth in Bristol and chucked into the harbour as part of the Black Lives Matter protests that swept the world after the murder of George Floyd in America. Avi Chomsky and Naomi Klein are among a minority of white voices arguing that the struggles against extractive industries, climate change and ecological destruction are inseparable from the historical struggle against racism and colonialism. So, under picturing, we've skimmed over and looked quickly at framing, representing, and now envisioning how new ideas are proposed in visual form. Frederick Jameson once wrote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." Painted soon after the French Revolution, this watercolour by Joseph Michael Gandhi uses dramatic composition and lighting in the contemporary traditions of Romanticism to envision the Bank of England at a time in the future when it will lie in ruins. In the 1968 film Planet of the Apes, astronauts return from space to find that time has been dilated and they are far in the future, long after the Earth has been devastated by war. By positioning an icon of visual culture in a hypothetical situation, the scenario invites the viewer to reconfigure the current coordinates of possibility. Here, the hypothetical question might be, whose liberty does the statue proclaim now? Sustainability might appear to be self-evidently a good thing, but what is it exactly that we want to sustain? And for how long do we hope to sustain it? Here, the Sony Corporation invites us to play in The Last of Us, an award-winning survivalist adventure. In the scenario of this video game, the industrial society has collapsed and people leave the city behind, making their way towards where we, the viewers, are already positioned. And that's in a romantic landscape in which nature is already returning. This image envisions a fantasy of the future based on redemption, but its central motif is a broken bridge, and that could be read either as a sign of the end of the age of fossil fuels or as a symbol of disconnection. The concept of enlightened doomsaying put forward by the French philosopher of science Jean-Pierre Dupuy involves imagining oneself in a catastrophic future to raise awareness and trigger action so that this future does not take place. So, is this The Last of Us escapist indulgence, or is it a warning? Critics and opponents of the global Occupy movement claimed that its refusal to set out a list of demands was the reason for its failure. But this image by the designer Kalle Larsson, which triggered the occupations that spread around the world, made only one demand: Occupy Wall Street, not as a means to an end, but an end in itself. As an expression of dissent, this image is somehow both clear and ambiguous. I think its visionary power comes from the way it represents social conflict in terms of sensory contrasts, such as between warm flesh and cold bronze, or between the solidity of the figures and the billowing clouds of tear gas behind them. I especially love the way that the elegant poise of the ballerina subordinates and also transcends the brute force and aggression of Wall Street's economic bull. It's good that there are different visions of a more resilient or sustainable future, because that means we don't have to like them all. In response to demands for radical change to save the planet, we're offered a vision of electric vehicles that we might not be able to afford to buy. It's true, we could breathe cleaner air if we got rid of fossil fuel engines. But if we still have to get out of the way when individuals of high net worth are in a hurry to get to the airport, maybe we haven't taken the right road. It's also true that demand for electric vehicles could break the fossil fuel industry and speed up the transition to renewable energy. So the balance of power might shift with a more radical effect than the makers of luxury cars intend. Renewable energy is far less bad than fossil fuel energy, make no mistake. But as the London mining network has shown, the extraction of minerals for the transition to a post-carbon society continues the long history of colonialism, which enriches people who are already rich, while dispossessing local and individual communities who are already poor, and irreversibly damaging fragile ecosystems. Elon Musk, the billionaire head of the Tesla Corporation and second richest person in the world, has envisioned the future of humanity as a multi-planet species. He's using the vast profits from the Tesla electric car to fund his private SpaceX corporation, which is rebooting space exploration after the withdrawal of public funding. SpaceX have made some amazing technical achievements, including reusable rockets which can return to the Earth from space and make a controlled landing backwards and upright. There's a fascinating Netflix series simply titled Mars, which combines documentary interviews with speculative visions of the near future, with communities of scientists, engineers and investors working to establish a colony on Mars. Although I admire the breathtaking ambition and the amazing technological achievements of Tesla and SpaceX, I'm opposed to the project of colonialism. Until we have decolonised our own planet and shown that we know how to use it properly and look after it, I don't think we should even begin colonising another one. Back to Earth now, and another version of the future rooted in the space age. For the Eden project in Cornwall, UK, the Grimshaw architects practice has built giant geodesic domes in a disused and barren quarry. Enormous polyhedral structures enclose microclimates, each supporting biomes or living environments from around the planet, offering a vision of technology going beyond sustainable design to achieve regenerative design. But this vision of a possible future could be seen as nothing more than just another theme park, offering an encounter with ecological thinking bounded by the cafe and gift shop. Why do so many visions of the technological mastery of nature come from the economic domination imposed by capitalism? Let's enrich these technological visions by situating them within different models of the social. The philosopher Peter Hallward, who gave a brilliant talk at Chelsea a while ago, wrote, "Isolated individuals can do little more than try to fulfill their immediate bodily needs. Socialised individuals acquire the capacity to act independently of such needs and to do what is necessary to transform their collectively created world." Solar World Cinema, based in the Netherlands, has a mission to bring unseen films to unusual places. They run a mobile cinema powered by solar energy in collaboration with the film festival Fi Sahara and the Abidine Qaid Saleh audio-visual school at the Dakhla refugee camp in Algeria. A Dream of a Low-Carbon Future is a graphic novel that imagines Britain in the year 2150 as a sustainable, prosperous, low-carbon society. It's not a fantasy utopia, but it does offer a vision of life beyond the climate and ecological crisis. While most future scenarios warn of the disaster coming, this publication takes on the more difficult task of balancing realism with optimism. The artist James Mackay says, "I'm not thinking of fantasy or sci-fi visions. I'm coming from a photo of a real place and then trying to work out what it would look like if you had new technologies inserted into that landscape." Buen vivir, which translates from Spanish as good living, could be considered as the South American version of the degrowth movement, which emerged in Europe as a search for alternatives to capitalist models of development. Like so many terms, buen vivir is hotly contested in the struggle for social justice, not least, of course, because Spanish is the language of the European colonisers of South America. Buen vivir is based on the indigenous vision of sumac causae, which translates into English as life in plenitude, or beautiful life. Sumac causae has forms of knowledge as principles: knowing how to eat, knowing how to drink, knowing how to walk, how to dance, how to sleep, how to work, meditate, think, listen, speak, love and be loved, and knowing how to dream. Today I've shown you some examples of how the practices of picturing, framing, representing and envisioning can help us think critically about the ideas of resilience and sustainability. So I'll finish by recommending that you view a short animated film, A Message from the Future, Part 2, The Years of Repair, in which artist Molly Crabapple animates a scenario envisioned by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Naomi Klein. In speaking about picturing sustainability and resilience, I've tried to show that framing and representing help us to critically engage with the world. These vital skills and practices prepare us for the task of envisioning. Faced with an uncertain and turbulent, dangerous future, art, design and the humanities share the ability to envision alternative possibilities and to choose from among them as an act of free will. If you'd like to discuss any of this further, do please get in touch. It would be great to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.